Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this part of the conference. And I'd like to introduce Claire and Pavita. Claire, and would you like to come on and tell us all about yourself, please?
Oh, how long have we got? I am quite old. Yeah, sure. Well, until very recently, of course, I was a professor of leadership at Henley Business School, and I recently entered the third part of my career from there, and I am now an independent coach and consultant. I've been a coach for a long time. I first experienced coaching when I was in the NHS in the 90s, so it must have been a very new thing at that time. And I remember the person who was coaching me saying, "What job would you really like to do?" And I said, "Yours." So I've been working towards that ever since. For those that have known me from Henley, I've been leading a big program with the Army. I was Director of Diversity and Inclusion, and teaching, researching in leadership in many forms. So I think that's probably enough about me.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Claire. And your partner in arms today, Pavita. Hello.
Good morning, everybody. Lovely to see you.
Morning, Pavita.
Morning, Claire. So I have a very different background. I spent over 25 years in large corporate organisations leading a global organisation effectiveness agenda. So I was a part of that remit, would have included diversity as well as leadership and talent and everything else, but also all our coaching partners. So I would have been the person, or someone on my team would have been the person sort of looking at the coaching relationships and who we work with, both firms and individuals. So for the last 10 years, I've been working independently. I'm a board advisor. I work with boards, chairs, CEOs and executive teams, advising them on issues around culture, and recently it's predominantly virtually all about D&I. So I'll go in and facilitate sessions with teams, and I'm also a coach, so I work with C-suite leaders, coaching them on their individual journey. And I'm also a non-exec on a number of boards, including the Equality and Human Rights Commission.
Lovely. So lovely to have you both here today. Thank you ever so much. And I'm going to throw a few questions your way, see if you can answer. But the audience that are with us listening actively, if you've got any questions, we'll take those at the end. So please feel free to pop your hand up on the screen, and I'll bring you in later on in the conversation so you can get to ask Claire and Pavita your own questions. But just to start us off then, the World Economic Forum has stated that in the UK it will take a further 99 years to achieve gender equality in the UK, and even longer in some other countries around the world. So what are the key actions that organisations, do you think, need to take to accelerate EDI so that true equity, diversity, inclusion and equality are achieved more quickly than the predictions state? And perhaps how can coaching help this? So a big question to start us off with, maybe Claire and Pavita. I don't know who wants to go first.
Shall I kick off, Claire?
Please do. Yeah.
So I mean, gosh, I get asked this question a lot. I think it's very difficult to sort of single in on one specific issue. I think in all my experience, what I would say is that there are things that I see organisations doing that make the biggest difference, and there's a couple of them. The first is not to be in denial. So when you look at, if you're working with an organisation, the first thing you do is obviously go and look at their website and find out what they're doing, and all over the website it says, "We are committed to diversity and inclusion in this institution." And particularly after the murder of George Floyd, there was lots of statements from CEOs, "We are going to redouble our efforts." I'm not even sure what that means, because if your ethnicity diversity is 0, you can't redouble 0. So frankly, if they're saying that, yet you look at the organisation and not just entry level, but all the way through up to the top, you do not see equal representation in terms of all the various protected characteristics, particularly when you look at things like gender and ethnicity, but obviously looking at all sorts of issues like social mobility, LGBT, all of those things. If you don't see a representative organisation, that organisation does not understand diversity and inclusion. So for me, the biggest issue is that gap between what they're espousing, stuff they put on the posters in the back of the toilets, versus what's actually happening. And I think when they try and close that gap and address it, that's the first thing organisations can do. I think the other thing is this notion of myth of meritocracy. So believing that if, good people write good processes and systems, that in itself will create equality of outcome. And we know that, you know, you can't just focus on equality of opportunity. You have to sort of look at what's actually happening in terms of outcome. And how that all links to coaching. Well, I mean, I think really some of the skills that are critical in coaching is bringing out in the leaders you work with of curiosity and empathy. And I think they are the two most fundamental features that leaders require personally in order to understand and address the issues of inequality in their own organisations. So I'll stop because I'm sure Claire will have lots of very compelling insight also.
A few things to add. I mean, absolutely, it's as you say, Pavita, look at the gap between what they say they do and what they really do. And from my experience, first of all, I think it's making it an organisation-wide issue, so that it's not just people in the top team who are owning this and you know, leading from the top, but it needs to be throughout the organisation, and bring EDI issues into every major and minor decision that's made. So on the agenda, there should be a consideration for what is the impact of making this decision on our diversity, social inclusion, you know, all of the equality factors that we take into account. But one of the things I'm really passionate about is not just looking at those broad brush equality groupings, but recognizing that everybody is unique, and that EDI needs to take into account all of those conversations of how uniquely different we all are, and making EDI an important issue in the organisation, so that there are people whose sole responsibility it is to make sure that EDI actions are taken forward. Building a group of allies, I think, is exceptionally important for whatever grouping you're talking about. So people who are not part of that group speak on behalf of those people, not for them, not using the, you know, not being their mouthpiece, but in a situation where a conversation is unhelpful maybe, but actually speaking up, and you know, making sure that you're championing that at every possible point. And of course, for an organisation, making sure that EDI carries through the pipeline, from recruitment through appraisals, through promotion, reviewing job descriptions, reviewing pay. You know, it's a holistic movement. And so for coaching, in my view, I think it's about exploring opportunities and obstacles that are existing to allow EDI to really flourish, and uncovering unconscious biases throughout the organisation. And through coaching, we can do that. We can surface those thoughts and those conversations really openly and in a safe space.
Lovely. So many things to think about there, and I'm just noticing that word holistic is really important, I think, isn't it? Because naturally, I think organisations tend to focus on the first part of the process, the recruitment end, and then it perhaps all tailors off from there.
It isn't a responsibility for just a pocket of people. It really is through the, you know, the heart and soul of the organisation.
Absolutely. So I'm going to suggest we do a quick poll here of our audience today. So and the question we'd like to ask you at this point is, have you been involved in a coaching programme where the objective has been to include or improve EDI in an organisation or for an individual leader? So if you could just take your time to answer that question. We'll see what the results are. Okay. Mel or Emily, if you could share the results when you think we've got enough responses, that would be helpful. Thank you. Oh no, look at that. So 70% of us have never been asked. So Wow. So what do you make of that, Claire?
I'm really surprised, actually. I thought it would be the other way round. I thought that lots of people would have been engaged in coaching programs. So but that gives us lots of scope to get this right.
Yes. Yeah. So maybe my next question then is, how can coaching support leaders specifically who want to create a more diverse and inclusive organisation? Perhaps Pavita, maybe have a go at that first.
Sorry, I'm going on mute because we've got lots of work going on in our garden. I don't want the noise to be distracting for people. So I'm hoping I can squeeze in through the banging. So look, I've worked with so many leaders who are mindful about thinking about the tone they set in their team, thinking about their own leadership. And one of the things I've discovered is that even when they demonstrate or cite a commitment to wanting to improve diversity in their organisation, what I've noticed is that it doesn't happen until they make a really, really personal connection with the issue. And that's hard to do, right? If you live in a bubble where everyone you socialise with and everyone in your social circle looks like you, is like you, was probably educated at the same school, possibly university, you don't see difference in your life. And the idea that someone else's lived experience could be very different to yours is quite shocking. And actually, one of the first questions I ask in organisations I go into to leaders I work with, what do you think the lived experience of those people who aren't like you is here? And they all say to me, oh, I would imagine it's exactly the same. And this is on the back of me perhaps doing 4 weeks worth of interviews with maybe young Black colleagues or women, and being shocked and horrified at the stories I hear. And yet this very well-intended attention leader is saying to me, oh, it's the same for everyone, isn't it? So that, I think, is at the heart of this. So I think a great coach can really help someone really connect at a personal level with what the issue is for them. And it might be an experience they've had personally or something they've observed. And an example I would give you is a colleague of mine I work with. She is on the board of the NHS. And she knew intellectually that health outcomes, particularly we know in the pandemic for ethnic minority people, are worse. You're more likely to die. But we also know historically issues like maternity and childbirth is very dangerous if you're from a BAME background. That's sort of minority ethnic background. And although she saw the numbers and she knew this was significantly a higher risk for those individuals, it wasn't until she was in a hospital and she was sat next to a patient's mum who was getting really anxious. And she said, don't worry, look, these are a great team. They're really going to look after your daughter. She goes, what is it you're worried about? And she looked at her and she said, she's Black. And she suddenly got it. And that's what I mean by making a personal connection. And so if your world isn't big enough, you can't do that. So I think that's what great coaches can do. The second thing is the other key features for having a really diverse organisation is a sense of belonging and creating psychological safety. So if you have a leader you're working with who perhaps is very unaware that they operate an in and an out team, you know, forget gender or anything else, just people who there's a dominant style, and those are the people who get spotted, get given the best assignments, get identified to be put on big projects, which means increases their chance, likelihood of being promoted. Then I think helping them see the impact of that and what happens and what it feels like to be in that out group and how people don't feel seen or don't feel excluded is really, really important. And we also know through the pandemic, mental health was a big issue, partly being away from everyone, that sense of psychological safety to feel I can speak up and say what's on my mind without fear of any reprisal is really important. So they would be the crucial things for me.
That idea of the in and out group is quite stark, isn't it? Really makes you think a bit differently. So what are the benefits then of taking a coaching style more generically, I guess, as leaders in our organisations, from building up EDI as a positive kind of culture? Claire?
I think that taking a coaching style means, you know, as we're taught right from the very beginning of when we learn to be coaches, is using our ears about twice as much as we use our mouth. You know, we've got 2 ears, 1 mouth, use them in that proportion, but also our eyes, and observe and listen really carefully to the conversations that are going on around you. When I was in the NHS, I had an absolutely brilliant CEO who really walked the talk, not specifically on EDI, but he would make sure that he visited at least 1 department every single day. So he wasn't just ensconced with his top team who were really very much like him. You know, big brains, but very white and male, apart from my boss, who was white and female. But he made sure that he was out and about in the organisation, observing, listening, having conversations with people. And I know an awful lot of leaders are quite scared of doing that and being out and about in the wilds, if you like. But he did it so often that it was not at all intimidating for him or the people that he was visiting. So open and safe conversations happened. And by doing that, he was able to ask them what the opportunities were that they had and the obstacles were that they were encountering. And so a leader who is willing to do that and to go out into not only into their own organisation, but to talk to all of their stakeholders quite often and ask those open questions, but make it in have those questions in a safe environment, psychologically safe environment, particularly for their own employees, is extremely important so that they can share things. And of course, the other great thing to be able to do, and this isn't just for the leader, but for all through the organisation, is to do reverse mentoring. When you have somebody who's really maybe not like you at all, and to be able to listen to each other about that lived experience and to absorb those experiences. I know in some of the Scandinavian countries and maybe more widely, they have listening libraries where you can actually go to the library. You don't borrow a book, you borrow a person. So why not have a listening library in your own organisation when you can go and borrow a person and talk to them and hear their story? And that's true. As I say, it's every one of us is unique. Some of us enjoy privilege that we may not even realise we are enjoying, and others therefore do not enjoy privilege, and we need to listen to their stories and listen to the things that are much harder for them than they might be for others.
I love that idea of a listening library. I think that's such an easy thing for organisations to be able to set up, isn't it?
Yeah.
And this idea that, you know, it's about open and honest conversation, and most importantly, creating a psychologically safe space to have those conversations. That's lovely. You touched on the idea of reverse mentoring there as being another kind of opportunity. And I'm wondering, you know, how can other forms of broad coaching tools, like potentially reverse mentoring, support the development of strong EDI strategies? And maybe Pavita, you could come in on that one.
Well, I think reverse mentoring is actually a fun, phenomenally powerful tool. I would say that probably in the organisations I work with, it unlocks probably the most insight and understanding. One of the hats I wear as deputy chair of the 30% Club, and we've been running a cross-company mentoring programme for 10 years. And we have thousands and thousands of people on it globally. But the benefit of that one is you operate with somebody who is in another organisation out of sector. And I think that's even more powerful, because then what you're doing is having a safe space to talk to someone who has a very different experience. And every year I'm just overwhelmed when I hear the stories, and we do the big session at the end when we review what's happened, and there'll be chairs and CEOs who say, actually, I think I'm the person who's got more out of this relationship than the amazing young woman that I've been mentoring, because actually I've learned so much. And actually, you know, she might have a young family, and I've realised that she's in a partnership where her partner works as well, and I've had to listen and understand everything she's grappling with in terms of trying to balance everything she's trying to do, and how she has to try and learn and navigate the unwritten rules that are in organisations that obviously we've all learned because someone told us on day one. But the women and all the other minority groups, it's a great big secret and no one's told them. So they don't understand where the soft power sits, or how you really get promoted, or the difference between sponsorship and mentoring. And we know that women and ethnic minorities are over mentored and under sponsored. So they've helped. So I think that insight has helped them make change in their own organisation. So that's really powerful. And I think the other thing is affinity groups are very helpful. I mean, all the research shows that they don't actually make a difference in terms of progressing the cause. They definitely make people feel better. And you could argue that's a form of sort of peer-to-peer coaching, because it's a safe space where people can go and talk about their experiences. But of course, it's completely pointless when you have, you know, I don't know, 100 women in a room talking to each other about how awful it is, and there's not one man in the room, because the men have all the power. And so it's really important those affinity groups are supported. And I won't do talks to women only groups now. I say to the organisation, they have to bring someone with them. So it's like bring a friend along, you know, and preferably a man, because there's just pointless me talking to a group of women about the challenges in a system that prevent them getting promoted when the people who hold the power aren't there. So those are the sorts of things I think make a difference.
Lovely, great. And are there any examples of good practice that you could describe to us of organisations who have adopted some of these things we've been talking about in order to strengthen their EDI success? Claire or Pavita?
And that's Pavita's domain. She's much more in tune with all the organisations than I am.
Well, I think it's the things I've been talking about, Sarah. That's exactly. Do you mean specifically from a coaching perspective?
Yes, I think so. Are there any other really great examples of organisations that you could, like almost as a mini case study, share with us?
Well, I think that no one organisation has got this cracked, right? So they're all doing different things. So, I mean, I think some of them will have specific development programs, which I'm not in favour of, because I don't think it's the minority groups that are broken. I think it's a system that's broken.
Yeah.
So I'm really not a fan of all women programs, but I can see, however, there being some benefits. I do a lot of work with young ethnic minorities, and in organisations, they are in such small numbers, and they don't have access to understanding where that soft power sits. So I think some form of development program which helps them get access to those individuals. So if the purpose of bringing them together is to do that, then I think that's powerful. And sometimes it's also about ensuring that if you want to get to the top and you've got no finance experience, for example, we know that, you know, there are so few female, there's more men called Steve and John in the FTSE 100 as CEOs than there are women. And part of the reason for that is mostly they often go through the CFO route, not always. So if you don't know that early enough in your career to make a change, then it's too late. So I think any programs that help people sort of understand the road to get to the top and the key skills you need, I think they're always very helpful. But I think it's the stuff I said earlier, you know, so it's the reverse mentoring, it's access programs, it's targeted development programs, it's any organisation that basically insists that their senior leaders know the talent on a personal basis, but it's done in a more transparent way rather than that ambiguous way where all the men suddenly have all the sponsors and not the women.
Yeah.
I do think that that what Pavita's just been talking about is part of the equity, you know, the focus development is part of the equity, part of the equation, the EDI bit, because we know that certain groups of people don't have as much courage, if you like, confidence to apply for roles as other groups of people, and therefore working on those soft skills as well as all-round organisational knowledge is a way of balancing up that that equation so that everybody feels that they are as entitled as each other to apply for promotion or apply for a particular job. So I do think that there are opportunities to be made to address areas where groups of people feel less confident to put themselves forward for whatever reason, and to kind of balance that up so that they do feel able.
Okay.
Yes, and I would say, again, we're back to sort of trying to fix the individuals, and that we know that obviously women particularly will not apply for jobs where a man will, because they'll overassume experience and competence and women will underestimate. But I think it can be even more powerful, as an and to your comment, Claire, to focus leaders on the stuff they're doing unconsciously that is actually making the difference. So, for example, we did some work, research at Percent Club about 5 years ago that looked at trio partnerships, a leader, and they could be men or women, and we did 50-50 across the FTSE 100. And the only criteria was they had to have 2 people in their team prepared to be interviewed, and one had to be a man and one had to be a woman. And we then transcribed all of those, and we had a team of psychologists working with us, and we sort of obviously coded it, and the patterns were fascinating. So what we saw is that the behaviours that were playing out, that were very gendered around decisions around careers, men and women were doing the same thing in terms of the assumptions they were making about women. So it wasn't just male leaders that were doing it, female leaders were doing it as well. And the common themes that came out were they were overestimating potential and ambition for men, and they were underestimating it for women. So when we asked them questions like, who do you think could do your job next, there was invariably a silence, and this is all about CEO, by the way, and diagnosed the organisation, but they always said the man in their team. And when we interviewed the men and the women and said, you know, do you think you could do your boss's job? The men invariably said, yeah, I'm generalising here, said yes. Yeah. And the women hesitated, but said, yes, you know, I think I could do it. But that didn't come out in the data. So it shows you that there is this overestimation and emphasis on assuming, making assumptions about people's capability. And the other thing that happened is when we talked about what will it require to do that next job, and what is it about these individuals that you value? And again, this is widely known research that with men, they talked specifically about skills, and with women, they talked about broader capabilities around team. You know, she holds a team together. She's really good at getting people to sort of mobilize around issues. She's really good at sort of helping us get through big. But with men, they were saying he delivered this, he did that, he did that. So again, as coaches, I think helping someone notice the differences they are, they're able to sort of draw out of their team, and recognizing in a more transparent and fair way what skills people have and what they do. And in research around executive hiring, what's been proven also is that if you say to a CEO, here's two candidates, they'll overestimate the ability of someone to do a job they haven't done if it's a man. So they'll say, he's done all these things, I think he could be the next CEO. With a woman, they'll say, she's never been a CEO, so she can't be a CEO.
Right.
So it's those sorts.
Fascinating, isn't it? I mean, so just to change track a little bit, what if you, as a coach, have an individual that's been referred to you for coaching who has a reputation for not demonstrating inclusive behaviours at work? How would you go about coaching that individual? Maybe let's start with Claire.
Okay. So first of all, given that this is an organisational referral, if you like, is to have that three-way contracting at the beginning, so that it's very clear some of the reasons why this coaching is happening, and to be clear that the organisation has a stake in what the coaching is for, and that it's not just an open coaching session to explore what the individual would like to talk about, as they will in all likelihood steer away from that kind of issue. And I would also want to explore the potential gap or the mismatch between what the individual feels their approach to EDI is, what their unconscious biases are perhaps, and what their approach is, and compare that perhaps with some of the reasons why they're in the coaching situation to start with. So why have they been referred to that process for it to take place, and really explore that gap in their own self-perception of their approach to whatever group or individuals it is that they might be transgressing, and the complaints, if you like, or comments that have been made about them by that group of individuals, and ensure that quite tricky questions in coaching are asked. Where you've got that psychological space, you can open up the conversation and be quite challenging. If you look at, you know, Heron's conversational processes, you can use the challenge in that conversation to really surface some of their actions perhaps that have gone awry, or their conversation, the way they speak to people, whatever it might be, but really get into that gap. And I think that coaching an individual like that might take a little while. I don't think that you are going to get to the heart of the problem perhaps in the first session or even the second session. You need to really explore that in depth.
Yeah, because as you say, I think it requires a huge degree of psychological safety for them to confront their unconscious biases.
Absolutely.
Doesn't it? And also a degree of courage on behalf of the coach to actually go there and have those conversations.
And selecting the right coach in that situation, I think, is right, because you don't want a coach themselves who might be overwhelmed by the strength of that person's convictions, if you like. It needs to be someone who is probably familiar with coaching at that level, whatever it might be, and who is prepared to hold their ground and to make those challenges in that safe space.
Yeah, lovely. Well, which leads me nicely on to our second poll of this conversation. So guys out there, this is your next question is, do you feel that you need to have a better understanding of EDI issues yourself in order to coach someone in this area? What do you think? And again, Mel, if you could share the results when you think we've got lots of answers there, please. Yes, well, so overwhelmingly 78% of us feel that we need a better understanding of this area ourselves to be able to coach there. What do you take from that, Claire?
I think that's a great result. Although we say as coaches we don't need to be, we are non-judgmental, of course, and we don't need to be subject experts. I do think that this is an area where if we're called to be coaching specifically or even indirectly, it's something that we should be able to do our own, look at ourselves and our own unconscious biases, maybe even have some supervision and mentoring around that, so that we can coach in that space confidently, but with skill and with caring for the coachee. So I think our own knowledge of that and our own self-awareness is important in that space.
Lovely. And I'm conscious I want to let the audience ask you lots of lovely questions, because I'm sure they've got hundreds. So finally, from me, what can we learn from coaching that will enable EDI to flourish? Pavita, maybe we'll come to you first.
Well, I always think that when you're coaching a leader in an organisation, the feedback you're getting around how they're leading, if you multiply that out, it gives you the culture of the organisation. So I've often, in organisations where I've led teams, insisted that all the coaches come together on a quarterly basis, and without talking about the individual, we do feedback around sort of what they're observing, because that's a mirror on the wider culture, and I've always found it really fascinating, and I think it's really important that we understand. So that sort of look at the system more broadly, I think, is telling you what the issues are. So if they're giving you feedback around themes that are happening, then invariably that's what's happening on your EDI agenda as well. You can see connections and linkages, and you're joining the dots. So I think there's a really powerful way, and often in organizations there are multiple coaches working, and even if you're just working with just one leader, it's the same thing. They're giving you a sense that they're mirroring back to you what that organization values, what really matters, and all of that is data when it comes to the D&I agenda.
Lovely, thank you. And Claire, is there anything you'd like to say to finish that off?
I think, again, saying, having the courage to challenge, because I think that most people have a higher self-perception of their openness to EDI than maybe the reality. I don't know. Obviously there's some people who are real experts in that area, but we are all human beings, and we are fallible. So having the courage to open up those conversations, I think, is important.
Lovely, thank you. So that's the end of my formal questions, and I'm sure all of you have many other things you'd like to ask of Claire and Pavita. So please take your microphone off, put your hand up, and I'll bring you in, and we'd love to hear your voices as well as see your faces. So please feel free to ask a question. Hello.
Hello, hi.
Hi.
Hi, so thank you. So my question is cultural related, because I'm from Denmark. I live and work in Denmark, and all of this is very UK focused, which is great. But what are your experiences in a more global perspective?
Pavita, do you want to take that?
Yeah, hi Charlotte. I've done a lot of work in Denmark, so I would
Okay.
say my experiences are global because I work globally. I think the challenges we're talking, I mean, there will be some cultural nuances in different markets. So for example, in the US, where they probably have a more advanced agenda in the workplace around some of these issues. So things like in the UK, there's a real silence on the issue of race. People are really scared. Leaders are terrified of saying anything, getting it wrong and being cancelled. So it's more progressive. We know in the Nordic countries they're further ahead on gender, for example, because of some cultural reasons. So we know that obviously men take a much more active role in the early years, child rearing, and so the issues around women are more about representation at the top rather than some of the societal norms that exist around who's, you know, the fact that when my kids are off sick at school, the school, despite me telling them, just always rings me, and I might be in Hong Kong at 3 o'clock in the morning, despite the fact my husband's name is on the list and my nanny, they still just ring me, which drives me nuts. So, you know, I think these things exist in all different markets. I work in India. The issue there is the government put in a legislation about having women on boards. The men just stuck their wives and mothers on the boards. So every market, every context has its own challenges, but there are themes, you know, and they would run through the things that we've been talking about. Claire, I don't know if you have a different experience.
Not a different one, but sort of addressing it from a different angle in terms of a coaching session itself. People respond differently from coaching, and coaches who work internationally will do well to learn how the coachee will engage with the coach. So certainly in the United States, in the UK, probably in the North European countries, we will be fairly forthright in what we want to say, and we'll be forthcoming in what we want to talk about. But if you move over to Asia, for example, certainly coaching in China and areas like that, people tend to be a lot more deferential in coaching, and so the way that you frame your coaching, the way that you structure your coaching sessions will be slightly different, and the way that you might ask some of the questions will be slightly different, and it's worth finding out what those nuances will be before you go into a coaching relationship with someone, so that you're there as service to your client, and therefore you want to allow them to get the best from themselves. I think that would be me.
Thank you. Thanks, Claire. And Jonathan, hello, you've got a question.
Hi, thanks so far for all of this really interesting session. I'm someone who that is affected by intersectionality, so I'm mixed race and I'm also gay. And I remember being part of a coaching session in the civil service a few years ago, where I remember having a reaction against it as a client because someone was talking about celebrating diversity at the time. And I thought, well, if the person next to me thinks I should burn in hell because they are a traditionalist from a religious point of view, it's really hard to celebrate the fact that they also have faith issues. In a modern context, I suspect that you might come across that when coaching on EDI issues around trans and female gender issues. So that was sort of my first question. How might you as a coach deal with that? And then secondly, having been a civil servant, no longer, I'm glad to say, because the government doesn't seem to believe in unconscious bias anymore, which I do believe in. And I'd just really like to hear your thoughts on how a coach might address that when coaching a really large public sector, now that it seems to be something that the government is trying to ban, essentially.
Jonathan, I feel your pain. I do a lot of work across the civil service. I feel your pain. Sarah, I'm happy to jump in and
yes,
speak my thoughts. I'm sure Claire will have lots of great insight on this as well. So on your first point about celebrating differences and perspectives and opinions and the fact that we're all individual and we all have a right to our own views. I think often the thing that sort of helps you guide you through that is going back to the organizational values, you know, and normally I know that basically people use different words, they all relate to the same thing. Every company, they look at ours, they're really new and different. I'm like, I've seen 55,000 versions of that around the world, and it's always things like, you know, respect, team, they love a little acronym with the letters and everything, but it is about mutual respect in the workplace, isn't it? You know, so when I'm working with organizations, maybe had a very serious issue around a racist slur being used, for example, and, you know, perhaps it's got very serious, there's been a breach. It comes down to, in this environment, we don't treat each other like that. So I might hold a view that's different to yours, and that's my human right. But at the end of the day, in this context, in this workplace, there are rules of engagement, and that is that we deal with each other with mutual respect. So I can retain my belief and view, but I must always treat you with respect. The minute I breach that and cross that line, it's a red line, which means you're out. So I think that's what leaders have to hold on to, which is, it's not about saying you're right, you're wrong, but about embracing the differences in all of us in a way that's mutually respectful. And when it comes to the civil service, this issue of bias, I think you have to still issue the same lessons around teaching, doing a teaching about what the issue is, but you have to call it something different. So I would call it closing the reality gap, you know, so saying to a leader, what is it you think that is going on with you versus the reality of what's happening in the organization? Let's unpack where that comes from and why you assume that if your colleagues are working from home, all the women are putting the washing on. I used to have a boss that used to say that to me at Barclays, you know, are you having a day at home to do your washing? I'm like, no, I can afford a cleaner, it's good, I don't have to do it myself. So I think it's just about helping the leader understand for themselves the gap that they perceive in their mind, that Claire was saying earlier, this overemphasizing and over-assertion about what they think that is they're doing versus the lived reality. So that is unpacking an unconscious bias, isn't it? I think it's wokeism gone mad, that's all I would say.
I love that, Pavita.
Claire?
Well, I would only really add, I completely agree with Pavita in terms of, you know, it's the values of the organisation, and espouse that openness and that ability to have your beliefs, but not to emphasize them on another person, that restricts that person's freedom to have their beliefs too. And I do think that organizations need to have processes in place for, you know, the term microaggressions, where a person is continually rehearsing their beliefs in front of others, and ascending menu, if you like, of measures to deal with that, up to and including firing somebody for gross misconduct. Because it's not acceptable to continually do that, but it should be ascending, because some people, you know, I always say, don't shoot the innocent. A lot of people say something and they really don't realize they've said it, and so they need to be called out in a, you know, respectful manner. But if they continue to do that, then there's an accelerating problem. So yeah, the values, espouse values of the organisation and live them. Yeah.
Really. There's an interesting comment that's just been put in the chat that I think is really worth reading. It's from Sedi. I'm sorry if I don't pronounce your name very well. But they say, I wonder whether it would be less of a challenge for coaches to coach leaders if we could move the narrative on from the silos of D&I to fairness. I believe that fairness is the final frontier. People want their leaders to be fair, work for fair organisations, and engage with organisational systems and processes that are fair. What do you think about the language of, you know, the D&I putting us actually into different types of silos? Is that helpful?
I think if I may come in here, I heard a lovely metaphor the other day, that sometimes having conversations about EDI can be a bit like leaving a box of fireworks with the lid off. You're just waiting for the spark to ignite. And I think that people will challenge the language, rightly so, because we don't get it right quite a lot of the time. But it's the most important thing is that we're talking about it, and that we are able to be free to talk about things, whoever you are. One of the groups of people I worry about most is social mobility, and people who are coming from, you know, less privileged backgrounds, who have a huge struggle to get somewhere, and the language isn't right yet, but there is language now. We talk about it, we open up the conversation. I like fairness, but it has a double meaning. Fairness.
Right. Yeah.
So again, you've got to really weigh up and accept that whatever you choose to talk about or to term things, some people won't like it, and you don't mean it, but it happens.
Lovely. Thank you.
I would just add that I think fair means different things to different people. I work with a lot of sort of really gnarly, hairy investment bankers, and they hate that word. And so I think Claire's right. You know, people can interpret. So I love the sentiment of what has been suggested. You know, I like to talk about language like leveling the playing field. You know, sort of, it's not about lowering the bar, it's about widening the door. It's making sure that we're all starting from the same place. And that's not about, because fairness, unfortunately, particularly in the UK, can mean benevolent, trying to sort of, you know, be soft. It's not hard, tough commercial language. In different markets, it will mean something different. So I think basically talking about, as if you look, take social mobility as an example, giving everyone the same start means that it's more equitable, and you're creating, you know, equity in your diversity agenda. I think that sort of language can, I think, be more helpful when you're talking to business leaders who, when they hear fair, think you're talking about giving someone a leg up for no reason, and tokenism. And we know that that's not helpful, but I love the sentiment of it.
Okay, thank you. Language helps us, and it also is a massive hindrance, right? Well, we're at 10 o'clock. Karen, hello. Thank you so much, Claire and Pavita.